Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel. We've been looking at Daniel chapter 9 for the last few days, looking at Daniel's third vision, his vision of the 70 sevens. We have one more thing to say about it, then we're going to move on to chapter 10. But you recall that the 70 sevens, the sevens represent years, weeks of years, 70 weeks of years. And we've noticed that the last seven is set apart as that final period. We saw that in the midst of that seven will be set up the abomination of desolation by the Antichrist. Let's read that verse again, verse 27 of chapter 9. Now he, this is referring to the coming Antichrist, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. That is that last seven, that last group of 7 years. In the middle of the seven, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out for him. So the last half of that week is a time of intense persecution of the Antichrist toward the people of God. And then it culminates with the return of Christ and the end of the age, and the inauguration of the fullness of the kingdom of God. Now, I've looked at this before, but notice is that last period, that last half of the seven that is important. That's the period of time often referred to as the Great Tribulation. But notice it's half of 7 years, so it's 3.5 years. Now, I mention this because several times throughout the book of Daniel, he mentions times, especially the phrase time, times, and half a time, which when we looked at it before, we saw that refers to the 3.5 years. We saw that phrase time, times, and half again in chapter 7 in verse 25. That was Daniel's first vision, and then there was the persecution of the little horn, the Antichrist, for that time, times, and half a time. Of course, it's mentioned here, chapter 9, verse 27, as half of that last week. And then it's mentioned again in chapter 12, in Daniel's final vision, when he's talking about the final period of persecution, and once again he refers to time, times, and half a time. So this seems to be Daniel's phrase to refer to that last assault of the forces of evil against the people of God in the persecution of the Antichrist. He refers to it as time, times, and half a time. Now we see this again in the book of Revelation. When you turn to the book of Revelation, this figure comes up again. In Revelation chapter 12, when it's talking about the dragon, which is Satan, making war against the people of God, it refers to time, times, and half a time, referencing back to the book of Daniel. And also when you will look in Revelation chapter 13, where it talks about the beast who comes out of the sea, the beast the dragon calls forth, which almost all interpreters agree is a figure for the Antichrist. And that beast makes his assault upon the people of God. It mentions that the period of time is 42 months. Now, 42 months obviously is 3.5 years. Once again, that time, times, and half the time. So I see throughout the book of Daniel, and then again repeated in Revelation, this time period of 3.5 years to refer to the assault of the Antichrist against the people of God, the time of tribulation. Now, why this phrase? Why time, times, and half a time? Why half a week? Why 3.5 years? Well, it goes back to what we saw in chapter 8. Do you remember we saw there the Antichrist of the Old Testament, Antiochus Epiphanes, and we saw that persecutor of the people of God in that day prefigures what the final Antichrist will do. And you remember we identified the Antichrist of the Old Testament as Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrated the temple in 167 BC. That was the original abomination that causes desolation. That set off a wave of intense persecution against the people of God. Eventually, the Jewish revolt was able to throw off Antiochus and free the people and rededicate the temple. Actually, the Jewish festival of Hanukkah is in remembrance of how the temple was reconsecrated after that sacrilege committed by Antiochus Epiphanes. But what is interesting is from the time Antiochus set up that abomination of desolation in 167 till the temple was reconsecrated, it was a period of almost exactly 3.5 years. It was time, times, and half a time. So they took that period of time that Antiochus had assaulted the Jewish people in the Old Testament, trying to destroy Judaism, and that became the number for tribulation, for an assault against the people of God. And so as the Antiochus Epiphanes, or the Antichrist of the Old Testament, did, so will the final Antichrist do, as he wages war against the people of God. What we've seen before in the attempt of evil to overthrow God's kingdom, we will see again at the end. And so that times and half a time becomes a powerful figure to communicate that the evil we saw in Antiochus Epiphanes will be repeated by the final Antichrist in his attempts to overthrow the people of God and his blasphemy against the Lord. Of course, it will end with the return of Christ and the establishment of the kingdom of God and the sweeping away of all evil. But that's what these times mean. It is a powerful reminder that what we saw with Antiochus, we will see again, but God will prevail and his kingdom will be established. Hope you join us tomorrow for our next 5-minute Bible study on the book of Daniel. We'll begin looking at chapter 10, which is the fourth vision of Daniel that he received in this book. But we'll start that tomorrow. So join us for our next 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel.